Hello again, folks. Welcome to Tomaskycast, the new edition of Tomaskycast, a TNR video. And you can see that I'm joined today by Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. He has a new book out that is in stores today and available online today. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But let's start with some news. Let's talk about reconciliation and Build Back Better. And let's be transparent with people that we're having this discussion on Friday the 8th, and people are going to see this on the 12th, so things may shift in between. But as of now, sir, where do you think things stand? Are we close to a number in the 2 to 2.5 trillion range, do you think?
I don't know what the number will ultimately be, but I think we're a lot closer than we were a week ago. And we're going to get this done. The policy imperative is just so strong. I think the political imperative is also very strong. But look, this is going to provide help for families who need childcare and help for young people who can't afford college. And it's going to continue to lift children out of poverty. The country desperately needs it. And I think coupled with a major investment in a green economy and infrastructure, it will be the biggest investment in the country since the New Deal. It's so desperately needed. I'm very confident that notwithstanding the difficulties so far, we're going to get there.
I wonder about whether you have internal discussions similar to the discussions I have with some of my friends in the journalism world, which is that there's a feeling that, and I'm not sure how you could have avoided this, to be honest, but there's a feeling that maybe you guys collectively let the top line number become the focus a little too much. And that sounds like such a huge number to people. And it's always discussed, 3.5 trillion, 3.5 trillion. It's really 350 billion a year. And if you add the offset revenues, it's really $60 billion a year in new spending. And do you think the way it's framed has hurt your argument? And do you ever discuss that in the caucus and how you can do anything about that?
Yes, actually, I raised this in a meeting I had with the president today. I was at the Oval Office for a signing of the Havana Act to protect our people from these anomalous health incidents going on around the world. And we got to discussing Build Back Better. And I made the point that we need to do more of what he's been doing, which is pointing out that the Build Back Better bill is paid for. The real number ought to be zero. And we need to be focused on letting people know that we're paying for this, that part of this is tax cuts that are paid for by making sure we reallocate the tax burden so that wealthier families and large companies pay some minimum amount of tax. And so, yes, I think we need to do a much better job communication. I think the president is doing well. I think those of us in Congress need to focus like a laser beam on what we're delivering and the fact that we're paying for it.
Yeah. I also have wondered, this has dragged on and on and on. And, if this were Republicans trying to pass a big bill, not that they have these kinds of ambitions, which is another topic, but if Republicans were trying to pass, a big bill, this kind of thing wouldn't be going on. It's partly a reflection of the ideological diversity of the Democratic Party, I suppose. But in these weeks, these have been pretty crucial weeks where the president's approval numbers have gone down. And presidential approval is a pretty big metric for midterm elections, as you know. Do you feel that this has done damage to the president's standing in any kind of permanent way, or at least a way that can last 13 months and therefore might damage you guys next year?
No, I think it's a reflection of the fact that we are at a momentary impasse in terms of getting both bills passed and signed. But I think as soon as we do, and I'm confident we will get it done and we will get it done soon, I think you'll see his numbers go right back up again. So I'm not concerned about that. I do think that we have raised a lot of expectations. If you think back to January, and one of my colleagues, Derek Kilmer of Washington State, asked me this question. If we think back to January and someone were to tell us, what would you think if we were to pass a $2 trillion measure that lifted half the kids in the country out of poverty and saved millions of small businesses and helped accelerate vaccines. And we got that passed very early. And not just that, but we also passed a $1.7 trillion infrastructure bill to rebuild our roads and bridges, our electrical grid. And that's not all. We also passed a major bill to provide childcare and paid family leave and help make sure the economy is working for everyone. What would you say about a 9-month or a 10-month period in which all that was accomplished? We would say that was tremendous, and it will be tremendous. It's already tremendous what we've been able to do, but we've raised expectations so high. I think we need to acknowledge that when we do get this done, it's the biggest investment in the American people, certainly since the Great Society and maybe since the New Deal.
Yeah, I think that's right. And people need to go out and brag about it if it happens. So let's turn to the book. The book is called Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Out from Random House, out today, Tuesday, October 12th. Tell people why you wrote the book.
I wrote the book because I feel a real sense of urgency about just how fragile our democracy is, how very close we came to losing it. It was an astonishment having lived through this from the inside, seeing the daily capitulations of so many of my Republican colleagues to the immorality of this president, the slow surrender of their ideals and ideology, that the predominant threat to our democracy could not come from outside the country, but now could come from within. Yeah. But that's where we are. The most threatening thing to the democracy is not another violent attack on the Capitol, although that might happen. It's this insurrection by other means. It's Republicans willing to use the president's big lie to usher in Jim Crow laws around the country and to usher in new laws that would strip independent elections officials of their responsibilities and give them to partisan boards, so that if Brad Raffensperger wouldn't find 11,870 votes that don't exist in Georgia, they will be able to find somebody who will. Yeah. I needed to sound that alarm, but I also wrote the book to give people hope. I wanted to bring them in the room with Marie Yovanovitch when she stared down the president and testified before Congress, and reintroduce them to other heroes like Alexander Vindman, and show that even as so many people were demonstrating, they didn't have the courage of their convictions, and their only motivation was power. You had other heroic figures who defied the president, who took on the most powerful interests in the world because they had such love for the country. Yeah. And those are the stories that ought to inspire us to continue the struggle.
I know you write about January 6th, and you were one of the 4 House managers, I believe, to oversee the certification vote. What was your experience of that day?
Well, I had suggested to the speaker about 6 months before the election that we form a rump group to try to scheme out all the things that might happen on election day and the aftermath so we could be prepared. And we looked at about 1,000 contingencies. And of course, the one that happened was not one we had predicted. And that is, we looked at what if the Electoral College was tied? What if a state sent 2 slates of electors? What if the vice president refused to accept a slate of electors? We weren't planning for insurrection. We did not expect a violent attack on the Capitol. But I was there on the House floor, really focused on my arguments and that of the Republicans. And the first I saw something wrong was when I looked up and noticed that the speaker was not in her chair. She intended to preside the whole morning and afternoon and evening if it took that long. And then shortly thereafter, the Capitol Police came onto the floor and rushed over to Steny Hoyer, our number 2, our majority leader, and grabbed him. And I remember thinking I'd never seen Steny move so fast. And pretty soon,
were you hearing anything in the background at this point? Were you hearing anything out in the halls?
Not yet. We did have the Capitol Police very soon thereafter come into the well of the House floor to tell us that there were rioters in the building. Yeah. And then come back and say, there are gas masks under your seats. You need to grab them and get them out. We will tell you when you need to put them on. And then we started to hear glass breaking. We started to hear people pounding on the doors trying to get in. I remember talking to a couple of the Republican members because I hung back for a while so that others who were more affected by what was going on could leave first. And they said to me, "You need to get out. You can't let them see you. I know these people. I can speak to these people. You're in a whole different category."
Right.
And my first impulse was to be kind of moved by their evident concern of my safety.
Yeah.
But my next impulse was, if you all hadn't been making up all these falsehoods about me, about the elections, we wouldn't have to be worrying about our safety right now.
Yeah. And that's, just to be clear, that's not because you were a Democrat. That's because you're Adam Schiff.
Well, yes. I mean, they were acknowledging that if the crowd found me, that I might be one of the top of their target list, apart from the speaker, the vice president, and some of our leadership. Yeah.
You have a lot of other interesting things in the book, but one in particular is a little story you have about Kevin McCarthy, your fellow Californian. You want to tell that story?
Yes, and I told the story because, well, two reasons. One, I'm often asked the question, do the Republican members really believe what they're saying when you talk to them in private? But also because Kevin McCarthy can never be allowed to get anywhere near the speaker's office. And this is why. I was on an airplane with Kevin McCarthy. I learned everything I needed to know with him from this small interaction. And we hadn't really known each other. We represent districts that are probably 100 miles away from each other. And we had a complete nothing of a conversation about who was going to win the 2010 midterms, which were coming up. I said the Democrats were, he said the Republicans were. And when we arrived in Washington, we went our separate ways, and I thought nothing of it until the next morning when a Hill newspaper comes out and it says that Kevin McCarthy gave a briefing the night before and said that everyone knows that Republicans were going to win the midterms. And Adam Schiff told him on the plane that Republicans were going to win the midterms. And I was incredulous because, of course, it was the exact opposite of what I'd said. And I immediately went to the House floor and I sought out McCarthy and I said, "Kevin, I would have thought if we're having a private conversation on the plane, it was a private conversation. But if it wasn't, you told the press the exact opposite of what I said." And he looked at me and he says, "Yeah, I know, Adam, but you know how it goes." And I said, "No, Kevin, I don't know how it goes. You just make, fill in the expletive up, and that's how you operate, because that's not how I operate." But that is how he operates. He was really made for a moment like this, when his party has no devotion to the truth, when it's all about achieving power or holding power. He is in that sense kind of a weaker reflection of Donald Trump. But so many others within the GOP are likewise willing to tell the biggest of lies that undermine our democracy, the lies that you can't rely on elections anymore, that they're somehow rigged when you lose. I can't imagine a more debilitating lie for a democracy than that one.
You write also about a couple of personal interactions that you had with Donald Trump, including, I think, in the Oval Office. You want to talk about those?
Sure. The first time was right after the midnight run, which, Michael, you may remember, was when my counterpart, then the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, went in the middle of the night or the late afternoon to purportedly go to talk to a whistleblower and get documents that showed that the Obama administration was allegedly spying on the Trump campaign. Well, then he had to go and present these documents to the White House. But within a matter of days, the press revealed the whole thing to be a charade, that in fact, the source of the documents that he needed to present to the White House was the White House. And when that blew up, the president invited me to the White House to see these documents. Nobody had even seen them. So I went to the White House to see them, and I was in an argument with the National Security Council lawyer about having my staff come with me when I was summoned to the Oval Office, but told essentially my staff couldn't come. I would have no witness to the conversation, which I have to say was pretty chilling, because if we got into a discussion of Russia and the investigation, I didn't want Donald Trump misrepresenting what was said. So I went into the Oval Office, and he's sitting behind the Resolute desk. And the first thing that strikes me is just how strange a picture it was to see Donald Trump behind that famous desk. It was like he had spent a career before the White House as a failed businessman pretending to be a successful one. And now he was pretending to be a president. It just seemed so wrong and out of place. So he comes up from behind the desk, he shakes my hand, and the first thing he says is, you know, you do a really good job. And when someone says that to you, your first impulse is to return the compliment. But I couldn't. And there was this awkward silence where I think I just thanked him for what he said, but could not reciprocate. It may very well have been that, look, flattery worked on him with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Basically, Putin could get him to do anything he wanted by just flattering Donald Trump. And he might have thought flattery worked that well on everyone.
Of course.
I did have one other very notable meeting with him. And it was over the downing of an American drone by Iran and what our response ought to be. And I was invited along with the chair and ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and our leadership, the speaker, the majority leader, minority leader. And when he arrived, he looked across the table and the first person he saw was me. And he just physically blanched. He must have been told that the chair of the Intel Committee was coming, but he wasn't told who the chair of the Intel Committee was. But the first thing he says is, "I'm glad you're here." And I said, "Well, I'm glad I'm here too." Mm-hmm. This was in the throes of the Ukraine investigation. I'm not sure at all he was glad that I was there. But we were trying to make small talk while we waited for the speaker, who was meeting with the head of state back in the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And I happened to mention that Secretary Esper, who was brand new, was a good choice because I knew Esper for many years. And I said, I hesitate to say that because, I don't want to hurt his nomination. And Trump didn't respond, but later in the conversation, he came back to me and he said, "Just how long have you known Esper?" And I thought, oh my God, I've killed his nomination. Yeah. Right. But the interesting thing about that meeting was that he asked not just me, but the others, all of us at the table, what we thought he should do to respond to the downing of that drone, and seemed genuinely and surprisingly interested in our answers, including my own. And I think that he felt he was being pushed into taking a provocative action by Bolton or Pompeo, and he wanted to hear some contrary views, and he ended up calling off the strike he had contemplated. So that was a very surprising interaction with the former president.
Yeah. That's really interesting. One of the few good things we can say about him is that he did not start a war. So you mentioned hope earlier. So what's the hope in the book? We're at a pretty perilous time. How do we save this democracy of ours?
Well, I think the hope comes from looking at those who have really been models of courage in these difficult times. Those like the Marie Yovanovitches and the Bill Taylors and the Alexander Vindmans, but also people like Dan Coates, a lifelong Republican senator who became the head of the intelligence community and stood his ground and spoke the truth and lost his job over it, as so many did who were willing to speak the truth during, maybe not so many, but those very notable a few. But also, members of Congress that risked their careers. When Mitt Romney rendered his verdict in the first impeachment trial, I was in the cloakroom, the Democratic cloakroom. Mm-hmm. There's a perception that after the trial, we all gathered to hear the verdict, and we did. But before we heard the verdict, we heard all of the individual speeches of senators announcing what their verdict would be. And that's really when we learned the fate of the trial. Yeah. And listening to Romney talk about what he had witnessed in the president's conduct. In the beginning, as I was listening to him, I thought, okay, there's a but coming. There's a but coming. He's awful. The president did terrible things, but it never came. Instead, what Romney said was that his religion and his faith was deeply important to him. He took an oath to God and to country, and he meant to fulfill it. And that he had children and grandchildren to answer to. And listening to him speak these words and the emotion that he demonstrated as he was, it told me that the founders were right to believe that people possessed sufficient virtue to be self-governing, that we didn't need to be ruled over by a despot. And I saw enough of those acts of courage that it left me very optimistic about the future. And I think others should be too. We're going to get through this. But what we do right now will determine how long it takes, how painful it is as it goes along. So we all have a role to play. And that's something I really wanted to get across.
What's the role of the people watching us right now?
The role is to figure out within their universe, within their world, what can they do now at a time when our democracy is at maximum peril. Not all of them can be a Marie Yovanovitch or an Alexander Vindman. Not all of them can have the courage to speak out against party or self-interest in the way that Mitt Romney and others did. But each of us has an ability to influence those around us. And we need to make use of that. And there are lots of good ways to do it now, powerfully online. People can organize, they can help fight these efforts to disenfranchise people of color around the country. They can donate their time, if they're lawyers, their legal skills, if they're organizers, their organizational skills. There's something we can all do at a time of maximum peril for our democracy. We just need to figure out what that is. And there's just nothing more, I think, disabling than the feeling that we're powerless to affect our circumstances. And the reality is we're not powerless. We all have an opportunity to engage. And when you engage, then you will feel much more optimistic about the future.
Before we go, a really quick January 6th commission question. So they're not answering the subpoenas. They're obviously not going to. Your next move, or presumably some future move, is to hold these people in contempt of Congress, to which I assume they say, so what? Hold us in contempt. We don't care. What happens then?
Well, this is a big difference between what we saw in the last 4 years, which is Congress could hold people in contempt. Indeed, we did hold some people in contempt for thumbing their nose at the law and compulsion. But they knew that Bill Barr, as Attorney General, was never going to enforce the law when it came to people who were exposing the president's wrongdoing or might expose the president's wrongdoing. He viewed the Justice Department as Donald Trump's private criminal defense firm. Well, Bill Barr's not there anymore. We have an independent Justice Department that believes in the rule of law. And if people fail to show up or fail to provide documents when they're compelled, they can be held in contempt. They can be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. And that ought to get people's attention. So the circumstances have changed. I'm very encouraged just today to see that the Biden administration not assert executive privilege over records that we were seeking from the Trump years, which they might have. Other executives might have decided, well, we want to protect our own prerogative in the future. But no, President Biden decided that this is so important, this armed attack on the US Capitol, that we're not going to stand in the way of Congress getting the information and providing it to the American people.
As Adam Schiff, the book is called Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Sir, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.